And Zelensky, I will say this, he wants to settle now. He's had enough. He shouldn't have allowed this to happen either. No. You know, if he's no angel, right, he shouldn't have allowed this war to happen. First of all, he's fighting a much bigger entity, okay? Much bigger. When he was, you know, talking so brave and so... Now, two things happened. They were brave, but we gave them billions of dollars. The United States spent $200 billion more than Europe. Why did we spend more? You know why? Because Biden never asked Europe to spend more. They spent 200.
It became a U.S.-Russia proxy war because of Joe.
Zelensky was fighting a much bigger entity, much bigger, much more powerful. He shouldn't have done that.
The Economist reports that Russia is slicing through Ukrainian defenses, and Ukraine is subsequently struggling to survive. Across the Western media, the public is prepared for defeat and painful concessions in future negotiations. The media is changing the narrative as reality can no longer be ignored. Russia's coming victory has been obvious since at least the summer of 2023, yet this was ignored to keep the proxy war going. We are witnessing an impressive demonstration of narrative control. For more than 2 years, the political media elites have been chanting Ukraine is winning and denounced any dissent to the narrative as Kremlin talking points that aim to reduce support for the war. What was Russian propaganda yesterday is now suddenly the consensus of the collective media. Critical self-reflection is as absent as it was after the Russiagate reporting. Similar narrative control was displayed when the media reassured the public for 2 decades that NATO was winning, before fleeing in a great rush with dramatic images of people falling off an airplane. The media deceived the public by presenting the stagnant front lines as evidence that Russia was not winning. However, in a war of attrition, the direction of the war is measured by attrition rates, the losses on each side. Territorial control comes after the adversary has been exhausted, as territorial expansion is very costly in such high-intensity warfare with powerful defensive lines. The attrition rates have, throughout the war, been extremely unfavorable to Ukraine.
Enters a third year of war. The 59th Infantry Brigade is facing a bleak reality. It's running out of soldiers and ammunition.
And they continuously get worse. The current collapse of the Ukrainian front lines was very predictable, as the manpower and weaponry had been exhausted. So why has the former narrative expired? The public could be misled by fake attrition rates, yet it is not possible to cover up territorial changes after the eventual breaking point. Furthermore, the proxy war was beneficial to NATO when the Russians and Ukrainians were bleeding each other without any significant territorial changes. Once the Ukrainians are exhausted and begin to lose strategic territory, it is no longer in the interests of NATO to continue the war.
Another commander estimated that just 60 to 70% of the several thousand men in the brigade at the start of the conflict were still serving.
And my friends, just yesterday, being the 25th of January, Russian media reported on the destruction of 12 Ukrainian brigades in the Kursk region. In quotations, units of the group of troops north during offensive operations defeated formations of tank, heavy mechanized, 4 mechanized, 2 airborne assault brigades, marine brigades, and 3 territorial defense brigades of the armed forces of Ukraine, the summary says. Over the past day, the losses of the Ukraine forces amounted to more than 360 people, 2 mortars, and a self-propelled artillery installation. In total, the hostilities in the Kursk direction, the Ukrainian enemy lost almost 55,000 servicemen, according to the Russian Ministry of Defense. So my friends, today's video will be different as it is not a frontline update. It is based largely on a very insightful and timely article from Professor Glenn Beason on how the Western media's narrative is conveniently changing to prepare its citizens for Ukraine's defeat in 2025. As such, I anticipate that this video may not do as well in the YouTube algorithm because I know most of you come here for frontline updates. Nevertheless, if you find value, leave some super thanks love. Also, I'm instituting a new edition for all my channel members. At least bi-weekly, I intend to publish short updates on the front giving news that did not make it into the public videos. I published my first one yesterday, or Greater Novosilka Front. Russian media led, and judging by the comments and the donation, the members found them quite useful. Also, I made a 13-minute video expressing my own unique thoughts on why I think President Putin waited until 2022 to amass troops on Ukraine's border, and more importantly, why I think, contrary to some, Putin will not want this war to end until his maximalist objectives are achieved in Ukraine. No, Trump fancies himself as an excellent negotiator, and more than likely, Putin would have gotten. So I encourage you to join the membership community and avail yourself of all the perks, and watch to the end to find an informative trailer on what you'll get when you join in the end screen. So without further ado, let's get into it. The political media elites weaponized empathy to get public support for war and disdain for diplomacy. The Western public was convinced to support the proxy war against Russia by appealing to their empathy for the suffering of Ukrainians and the injustice for their loss of sovereignty. Yet, all appeals to empathy are always translated into support for continued warfare and dismissing diplomatic solutions. Those who disagreed with NATO's mantra that weapons are the way to peace and instead suggested negotiations were quickly dismissed as puppets of the Kremlin who did not care about Ukrainians. Support for continued fighting in a war that cannot be won has been the only acceptable expression of empathy. Great power rivalry is largely a battle of narratives, says Professor Deason. The weaponization of empathy enabled the war narrative to become impervious to criticism. War is virtuous and diplomacy is treasonous, as Ukraine was allegedly fighting Russia's unprovoked war with the objective of subjugating the entire country. A strong moral framing convinced people to deceive and self-censor in support of the noble cause. Even criticism of how Ukrainian civilians were dragged into cars by the government and sent to their deaths on the front lines was portrayed as supporting Kremlin talking points, as it undermined the NATO war narrative. Reporting on high Ukrainian casualty rates threatened to undermine support for the war. Reporting on the failure of sanctions threatened to reduce public support for the sanctions. Reporting on the likely US destruction of Nord Stream threatened to create divisions within the military bloc. Reporting on the US and UK sabotage of the Minsk Agreement and the Istanbul negotiations threatens the narrative of NATO merely attempting to help Ukraine. The public is offered the binary option of adhering either to the pro-Ukraine NATO narrative or the pro-Russia narrative. Anyone challenging the narrative with inconvenient facts could thus be accused of supporting Moscow's narrative. Reporting that Russia was winning was uncritically interpreted as taking Russia's side. There are ample facts and statements that demonstrate NATO has been fighting to the last Ukrainian to weaken a strategic rival. Yet, the strict narrative control entails that such evidence has not been permitted to be discussed. Now, Professor Deason ventures in to discuss a bit about the objectives of our proxy war, which is bleeding the enemy side.
If America doesn't assist Ukraine, Putin is all too likely to succeed.
The strict demand for loyalty to the narrative conceals unreported facts that US foreign policy is about restoring global primacy and not an altruistic commitment to liberal democratic values. The US considers Ukraine to be an important instrument to weaken Russia as a strategic rival. The RAND Corporation, a think tank funded by the US government and renowned for its close ties with the intelligence community, published a report in 2019 on how the US could lead Russia by pulling it further into Ukraine. RAND recognized that the US could send more military equipment to Ukraine and threatened NATO expansion to provoke Russia to increase its involvement in Ukraine. In quotations, providing more US military equipment and advice could lead Russia to increase its direct involvement in the conflict and the price it pays for it. While NATO's requirement for unanimity makes it unlikely that Ukraine could gain membership in the foreseeable future, Washington pushing this possibility could boost Ukrainian resolve by leading Russia to redouble its efforts to forestall such a development. However, the same RAND report recognized that the strategy of bleeding Russia had to be carefully calibrated, as a full-scale war could result in Russia acquiring strategic territories, which is not in the interest of the United States. After Russia invaded Ukraine in February of 2022, the strategy was similarly to keep the war going as long as there were no significant territorial changes. In March 2022, Leon Panetta, former White House Chief of Staff, US Secretary of Defense, and the CIA Director, acknowledged, in quotations, "We are engaged in a conflict here. It's a proxy war with Russia, whether we say so or not. The way you get leverage is by frankly going in and killing Russians." Even Zelensky recognized in March of 2022 that some Western states wanted to use Ukraine as a proxy against Russia, in quotations.
Я думаю, що у всіх різні інтереси. Причому у всіх, у Заходу є ті, хто хоче, щоб ця війна йшла довго. Тому що це буде виснаження Росії, але ціною України, ціною життя людей.
US Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin outlined the objectives in the Ukraine proxy war, too, as weakening its strategic adversary. In quotations, "We want to see Russia weakened to the degree it cannot do the kind of things that it has done in invading Ukraine." So Russia has already lost a lot of military capability and a lot of troops, quite frankly, and we want to see them not have the capability to very quickly reproduce that capability. There have also been indications of regime change or the destruction of Russia as wider goals for the war. Sources in the US and UK governments confirmed in March of 2022 that the objective was for the conflict to be extended and thereby bleed Putin, as the only endgame now is the end of the Putin regime. President Biden suggested that regime change was necessary in Russia. For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power.
For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power.
However, the White House later walked back Biden's dangerous remarks. The spokesman of Prime Minister Boris Johnson also made an explicit reference to regime change by arguing the measures we are introducing, that large parts of the world are introducing, are to bring down the Putin regime. James Heappey, the UK Minister of the Armed Forces, similarly wrote in the Daily Telegraph. Charles Freeman, the former US Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs and Director for Chinese Affairs at the US State Department, criticized Washington's decision to fight to the last Ukrainian. Republican Senator Lindsey Graham outlined the favorable arrangements the US had established with Ukraine. In quotations, "I like the structural path we are on here. As long as we help Ukraine with the weapons they need and the economic support, they will fight to the last person." The Republican leader, Mitch McConnell, cautioned against conflating idealism, the hard reality of US objectives in the proxy war. In quotations, President Zelensky is an inspiring leader, but the most basic reasons for continuing to help Ukraine degrade and defeat the Russian invaders are cold, hard, practical American interests. Helping equip our friends in Eastern Europe to win the war is also a direct investment in reducing Vladimir Putin's future capabilities to menace America, threaten our allies, and contest our core interests. Finally, we all know that Ukraine's fight to retake its territory is neither the beginning nor end of the West's broader strategic competition with Putin's Russia. Senator Mitt Romney argued that arming Ukraine was, and I quote, "we're diminishing and devastating the Russian military for a very small amount of money. A weakened Russia is a good thing, and it comes at a relatively low cost, as we're losing no lives in Ukraine." The new victory narrative is required as a NATO-backed Ukraine cannot realistically defeat Russia on the battlefield. The strongest narrative is obviously to claim that Russia has failed in its objective to annex all of Ukraine, to recreate the Soviet Empire, and thereafter conquer Europe. This narrative enables NATO to claim victory. After Ukraine's disastrous counteroffensive in the summer of 2023, such a new narrative was indicated by Ignatius in the Washington Post, where he argued the measurement of success is the weakening of Russia. Meanwhile, for the United States and its allies, these 18 months of war have been a strategic windfall at relatively low cost, other than for the Ukrainians. The West's most reckless antagonist has been rocked. NATO has grown much stronger with the sanctions of Sweden and Finland. Germany has weaned itself from dependence on Russian energy and in many ways rediscovered its sense of values. NATO squabbles make headlines, but overall, this has been a triumphal summer for the alliance, and that is the new narrative. Sean Bell, a former Royal Air Force Air Vice Marshal and Ministry of Defense staffer, argued in September of 2023 that the war had significantly degraded the Russian military to the point it no longer poses a credible threat to Europe. Bell therefore concluded that the Western objective of this conflict has been achieved. And I quote, "The harsh reality is that Ukraine's objectives are no longer aligned with their backers. The Ukrainian proxy has been exhausted, which ends the proxy war unless NATO is prepared to go to war against Russia. As NATO is preparing to cut its losses, a new narrative is required. As the narrative changes, it will soon be permitted to call for negotiations as a display of empathy for the Ukrainians."
Хочу, чтобы меня услышали и простые граждане западных государств. Вас сейчас настойчиво пытаются убедить в том, что все ваши трудности – это результат каких-то враждебных действий России, что из вашего собственного кошелька надо оплатить борьбу с мифической русской угрозой. Все это ложь. А правда в том, что текущие проблемы, с которыми сталкиваются миллионы людей на Западе, стали результатом многолетних действий правящих элит.
So that is it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. Now I have a few videos here that I think are very useful for you if you're considering subscribing to the channel or becoming part of the exclusive and very informative membership. Watch this video here for a trailer on what you'll get if you join the channel membership. Watch this video up here, which I think is a good corollary video to this video. And watch this video up here for a recent update that I gave for my channel members on the situation in Velika Novoselka and Toretsk. And lastly, this video here is for my exclusive analysis top tier members, which is my own analysis on why I think Putin invaded in 2022 when he could have done it earlier, and also why I do not think Putin plans to stop until his maximalist objectives in Ukraine are achieved, which is not what the West says of conquering all of Ukraine and re-establishing the Soviet Union, but which is much more than Putin said in his February 2022 speech.